During our second week of Reconnecting, we talked about some of those challenges that we're going to face in our life of prayer and deepening this connection that we have with God called prayer. And those three challenges would be sin, distractions, but then also kind of counterintuitively just myself, like my own ego, my own expectations, kind of what I expect prayer to be. Here's the thing, though. I was a little imprecise. Sorry. Yes, sin is going to prevent us from having a deep connection with God. But like our weakness, our woundedness, our brokenness, this tendency we have to sin, that part of us that is inclined towards sin, that's actually one of the primary and ordinary places God will connect with us. It sounds weird to say that, because don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying sin's going to get you closer to God. No, not going to work. Sin doesn't. But the fact that we sin, that we are weak, that we are broken, that we are wounded, that there is something wrong, that's what draws God close to us. Like, it's even the word salvation. You know where that word comes? There's an English word for salvation. The word is salve. Like the salve you put on a wound. So it's an ointment. It's something that heals. The salvation that God brings, the reason that God becomes man. It's not because we were doing great and God's like, let's go hang out with those winners. No, God's like, they're struggling. We better go help. And so God comes as Savior to bring salvation, healing, newness, renewal. Right? That's why God shows up. So it shouldn't be a shock to us that it's in our brokenness and woundedness that God comes. This is one of the most important kinds of prayer then, the prayer we want to talk about today, the prayer that we heard in our psalm today, which is called the prayer of confession. And it's not just going to confession. It's different, important. I'm not saying don't do that, but there's this kind of prayer that we call the prayer of confession. What if there was a way, that after we had failed, we could process and pray through that experience in a way that's helpful and actually draws us closer to God again? What if we could work through that in a way that didn't just leave us feeling worse about ourselves and more ashamed and more guilty and like, man, I just should quit? What if there's a way in prayer that even our confession of sins can open us up to something new that God wants to do within us? And that's what we want to talk about today. The first thing we have to admit, though, is this. It is part of our cultural upbringing to reject the problem. Anyone here an American? Okay. So we just naturally have this tendency to reject this. Everyone thinks that the big problem is that people are atheists. But I've told you before, like everyone actually believes God exists pretty much. At least here, especially here in Rice County. Like pretty much everyone believes God exists. That's not the problem. What's the problem? To get real technical, people don't believe in the doctrine of original sin. In other words, people reject this idea, the teaching of our church, this deep truth, that deep within the human heart is something horribly wrong. Something has been wounded. There's something within us in need of rescue, of redemption, of salvation. That's the part that we reject. But the story that solidified like the reality of this for me, I'm pretty sure I've told it before. I told it at Daily Mass this past week, so if you go to Daily Mass, I'm so sorry for the repeat. But a story that's very powerful that showed me just the reality of this wound within us is the story of Yechiel Denur. So like back in 1961, Adolf Eichmann, who was the big mastermind behind the concentration camps during World War II. Not a buen hombre, he's pretty rough. Okay, but in 1961, he was finally captured and put on trial for his crimes. Okay. One of the people that testified at his trial was a Jewish man by the name of Yechiel Denur. Yechiel had been put on the trains personally by Eichmann. Eichmann had ripped up his visa, ripped up his passport in front of his face. And so it's not like he didn't even know the guy. He was put on a train to the concentration camps by Eichmann himself. And so there in court that day, he's testifying against him. But if you go, and you can go Google it, you can go watch the video. It's pretty powerful. In the middle of his testimony, he just begins sweating and breathing really, really hard. And eventually he passes out there in the courtroom. They have to drag him off. Decades later, he's on 60 Minutes. He's getting interviewed by Mike Wallace. And Wallace asks him, shows him the video, and he's like, hey, you remember that? What happened there, buddy? Were you angry, frustrated, hatred? Was it PTSD? What happened? What caused you to pass out? And Yechiel, the shocking answer Yechiel gave was this: It was not hatred. There was no hatred, but hatred for human beings. I was afraid, he says. I was afraid of myself. What? What does that mean? Face to face with this man that had literally sent him to a death camp, Yehiel had the realization that this man wasn't Satan incarnate. This man wasn't some demon. Adolf Eichmann is a human being. And if that guy is capable of something like that, then I am too. If there is something within him that could lead him to do that, who's an ordinary man, that exists within me too. And so Yehiel then told Wallace this. Again, he just said it. I am capable of this. I am no different than him. And that's what caused him to pass out that day. So bingo, right? Yehiel's dead right. He puts his finger on that very deep truth, this truth that within us, within the human heart, is something deeply wrong, something deeply wounded. I'm not worried about y'all like sending people to concentration camps, but we have to recognize that that same wound exists within us. This is precisely what modern humanity rejects. Everybody believes God exists, not an issue. But people very much do not agree with the fact that we all carry that same wound, that the problem is right here. And if the problem's not here, where is it? Process of elimination. It's out there. If the problem's out there, we just need to go fix out there. We need to go elect the right person into office, pass the right laws. We need to go do the right community projects to get everybody a better life. We need to fix our school. We need to fix our social justice programs. We need to get our sports programs to a place where our kids have something to do instead of beat each other up. That's what we need to do. That's the problem. It's out there. We need to go fix out there. And it's not like any of those are bad things. But we're fundamentally denying that the issue is within the human heart. And so we're missing the problem to begin with. Yehiel had a very important realization that day. It's the same realization. Have we ever heard of G.K. Chesterton? Chesterton was a very famous English man, a very famous English Catholic. And one day there was this big essay contest. What's wrong with the world? And Chesterton, who could write volumes, like he wrote books on books on books. He had no problem writing. Chesterton writes a 2-word essay. What's wrong with the world? 2 words. I am. And he won. Nice. But that's what it is. We have to recognize this deep wound within us. We reject confession, the sacrament of confession, and just the prayer of confession, because we reject that there's something fundamentally wounded within us. Oh yeah, Father, I'm impatient with my kids. I say some bad words. I know. It's not what we're talking about. There's something deep within us that only God can address, that only God can fix. This is why we need this thing we call salvation. So our readings today, especially our first reading in our psalm, they make no sense unless you have that truth, unless you agree with it. Okay, they're not going to make sense. The first reading, Jeremiah, he has this profound realization, literally an inspiration from God of what? Humans need a new heart. This law of God, we can't just have the laws. We know the laws. We're trying to be good people. It's not working. We need the law, as he says, inscribed on our heart. Some transformation of the heart has to happen.
And this is the same David had centuries before when he wrote Psalm 51. The most famous of what we call the penitential psalms. David prays, "A clean heart create for me, O God, and a steadfast spirit renew within me." So this is what David's praying for, this transformation. Do you know what happened to David? What led to this realization? Anybody know? That David was the great king of Israel. He was a man after God's own heart. That's pretty great. That's a pretty good heart there. So why does he need a new heart? What's wrong with the one that he's got? One afternoon, as the story goes, David, a man with the best of heart, again, David falls into adultery. And after this woman discovers she's pregnant, he goes into a whole process, all in an attempt to cover it up. And eventually kills this woman's husband. And in this psalm is recounted David's great realization. Not even he who is a man after God's own heart, not even he is free from this deep wound within his heart. If even David is capable of this, it's the discovery of Yehiel the Know, right? I'm exactly like him. My heart's the same. But look, it's through this experience of a moral failure, that David also shows us the pattern of the prayer of confession. And this method of returning to God so as to experience a healing, a restoration, a renewal of heart. And there's 7 of these penitential psalms. Like David knew this full well. The 7 is a biblical number of fullness. He was fully aware of this need for this prayer of confession. Psalm 51 is the most famous of the penitential psalms. Psalm 32 is a better example. Psalm 32 is a powerful description of the need for this prayer of confession. In the beginning, David prays this: I kept my sin secret, and my bones wasted away. I groaned all day long. Indeed, my strength was dried up as by the summer's heat. So what's David getting at? It's an experience I'm sure none of you have ever had, but it's an experience where you make some decision, you do something stupid, you sin, and then you just start bottling it up. You promise, I'm never going to tell anybody, but then it just eats your lunch. It just begins to eat you alive. I kept my sin secret, and my bones wasted away. So I've never done this, but it's like, you accidentally leave something in the back of your fridge for 12 months. Then you're like, I'm not even going to open that Tupperware container, just straight to the trash. Right? That's what it is. Something's just eating away, just rotting away within him. So then David prays this, Psalm 32 again. To you I have acknowledged my sin. My guilt I did not hide. I said, I will confess my transgression to the Lord. In this one verse, David actually uses all 3 Hebrew words for sin. I'm not going to geek out on you today. We're not going to talk about those words today. But it's just a beautiful poetic image of David acknowledging having done everything wrong. But what does he also show? He shows the path to move forward. Okay, 3 steps. What does David do first? First, I acknowledged my sin. In other words, David owns it. What do we typically do with our sin? We rationalize it, right? We explain it away. We're like, it wasn't that bad. Maybe people didn't really realize it. Or my favorite is, well, I know the church says it's a sin, but I don't know if I agree with that one. No, it's like own it, name it, claim it. That's it. David, I acknowledge my sin. The second thing David says is my guilt I did not hide. In other words, he's making the decision to clean out the refrigerator, so to speak, bring it out. Then third, he says, I will confess my transgression to the Lord. And confess just means to tell the truth. Just get it on the table. So acknowledge, stop hiding, confess. What's God's response to this prayer of confession then? David then writes, and you, Lord, you forgave the guilt of my sin. Not, oh, Lord, you started thinking about a punishment for me. No, and you forgave, period. When we bring all this forward, God's response is to forgive. To meet us in our weakness, to meet us in our brokenness, to forgive. The real question then is, why wouldn't we do this? Oftentimes, I think we just don't like digging into those parts of our life. They're messy. They are not pretty. Some things we just don't have to face again, let's be honest. We don't. Like for some of us, these are places of like deep shame or embarrassment, anger, resentment. And sometimes these places aren't even entirely our fault. Sometimes we have habits and patterns of sin that they just stem from a place of a deep wound, something that was done to us by a father, a mother, brother, sister, another adult, even just accidents. We carry deep wounds within us, the most fundamental being original sin, yeah, but others just that are seemingly as deep. Like, I'll give you just a concrete example. It's more fun when I do this, apparently, so I'll just do my public confession and y'all can not. Okay, I'm a raging workaholic. Like my whole life, I've done this. And I've chalked it up just to being tough or being a hard worker, being a good American, right? But I now regularly confess, like it's just my lack of trust in God's care for me, my self-reliance, my ungodly self-reliance. This belief that, well, yeah, God cares for us, but like we kind of have to do it all ourselves. Right? That's what it is. But on a recent retreat, the Lord, in the most gentle voice, because he knew I was ready for this, the Lord revealed to me where this came from. He gave me this memory. He brought up a memory during my prayer, this prayer of confession. And it was when I was 5 years old. We went swimming at the YMCA. And at 5 years old, I just jump in the deep end. And like the 5-year-old that I was, I couldn't swim. So I just start bobbing up and down in the water, just thrashing in the water, trying to survive. And even though my brothers are there, even though there's probably a lifeguard there, no one comes to help. And eventually I make it over to the side. Like, obviously, here I am, still alive. But in that memory, what the Lord revealed to me is that in that moment, I made a vow. 5 years old, I made this vow. And the vow went like this: I'll never rely on anyone else again. I'll take care of things myself. Why? Because no one cares. That was it. I'll just do it myself. Now, that may sound like a really trivial thing to you. And like it sounded pretty trivial to me when it was brought up to me in prayer. But as I continued to pray with it, as I continued to trace that throughout my life, I began to see that vow pop up over and over and over and over again. Just, I'll take care of it myself. No one cares. I'll just do it myself. So just think about that. A vow made by a 5-year-old kid after a pretty normal experience of, getting stuck in the water. Like, suck it up, kid. No, but that was a source of a deep wound, something that still affects me even to this day. I've been stuck with this ungodly self-reliance for years, decades. I confessed it so many times, but do you see, God didn't reveal my sin to me in order to shame me or to make me feel bad about it. He allowed me and revealed the sin to me. He allowed me to confess it so that he could then ultimately reveal this wound that fueled my sin, this wound within my heart, and then he could begin his work of healing. I'm the one that I had to be willing to open that up. St. Jerome, he had this very famous line. St. Jerome said, if the sick person is too ashamed to show his wound to the doctor, medicine can't heal what it doesn't know. But that's what confession does. It opens us up to this deeper work that God wants to do. That's the point. Here's the point. The prayer of confession, it's not meant to make us feel bad for what we've done, to beat ourselves up, to live in our shame. No, if that's happening, you're doing it wrong. The prayer of confession, and then even going to confession, the sacrament, this is a powerful means of entering more deeply into our relationship with God. Confession opens us up to the powerful ways in which God can transform even the deepest parts of our heart.